Food webs and competition practice. Today we're going to investigate how organisms and populations in an ecosystem depend on and may compete for biotic factors such as food and abiotic factors such as quantity of light, water, range of temperature, and soil competition. You can click here for a video on food chains and food webs by Discovery. Starter, in this ocean ecosystem, what can organisms compete for? So, looking here in this ocean ecosystem, think of those biotic and abiotic factors that organisms can compete for. So, organisms and populations can compete for sunlight, living space, food, and oxygen. So, here, food would be a biotic factor, while sunlight, living space, and oxygen would be your abiotic factors. This graphic shows a single food chain and how it's linked to a group of food chains. Together, they make a food web. So let's have a look at that. So here we have a food chain. You have your producers, okay, your plants, and the plant's energy gets transferred to the primary consumers. The primary consumer's energy gets transferred to the secondary consumers. And then what you have are your decomposers after that organism has died to break down that dead, decaying material. So in here, you can see your original food chain. Here it is, from your plants to your squirrel to the fox, and then your decomposers. Now you can also see two other food chains in here. So we call this a web when we have more than one food chain involved. Let's click on the picture to read an article on food chains and webs. So, what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is made up of all the living and non living things in an area. This includes all the plants, animals, and other living things that make up communities of life in an area. An ecosystem includes non living materials, for example, water, rocks, soil, sand. A swamp, a prairie, an ocean, and a forest are examples of ecosystems. An ecosystem usually contains many different kinds of life. A grassland, for example, is an ecosystem that contains more than just grass. It includes plants, animals, insects, earthworms, and many tiny living things in the soil. So there's three roles. Each living thing in an ecosystem has a role to play: a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. Green plants are producers. They make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. Animals, including humans, are consumers. They eat or consume plants and other animals. Bacteria and other living things that cause decay are decomposers. Decomposers break down the waste products and dead tissue of plants and animals. They return nutrients to the soil where new plants grow. The way that producers, consumers, and decomposers provide nutrients for one another is called a food chain. Feeding levels. A food chain describes the sequence in which matter and energy move through the feeding levels of an ecosystem. The levels of a food chain are essentially the same across ecosystems. The first level is the producers. After that, the consumers. Sometimes consumers are further divided into primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. The final link in all food chains are the decomposers, which break down the dead organisms and natural waste. The consumers at the top of the feeding level of a food chain are called top predators. They have no predators. Instead, their population size is controlled through competition. So, energy flow. The main source of energy in almost all ecosystems is the sun's energy. As energy moves through the ecosystem, much of it's lost at each feeding level as heat. This is the main reason why few food chains have more than 5 feeding levels. Diagrams called energy pyramids are used to depict the flow of energy from one feeding level to the next in the food chain. Most ecosystems have more than one food chain. Food chains overlap and connect to form a food web. Recycling nutrients. Water, carbon, nitrogen, and other elements constantly circulate through an ecosystem. Carbon and oxygen form carbon dioxide as well as nutrients from soil and enter into plant tissues. When consumers eat plants, the nutrients enter the consumer's tissue. Consumers that are eaten transfer nutrients to the predator at the next feeding level. Consumers that are not eaten die and transfer nutrients into their decaying tissues to the decomposers that feed on them. Decomposers recycle these nutrients back into the ecosystem. They transfer the nutrients back into the soil and air where the nutrients become available to producers. A delicate balance. An ecosystem's health depends on the delicate balance among all its members and environment. If something disturbs the balance, the ecosystems and all its members might suffer. Natural things that can disturb ecosystems include a changing climate and natural disasters. Human activities that disturb ecosystems include polluting and clearing land for farms and buildings. Humans are also responsible for many invasive species. An invasive species is a living thing that spreads through an ecosystem where it did not exist before. Invasive species can threaten plants and animals that originally make up the ecosystem. For example, the Burmese pythons were brought to Florida as pets. Some pythons escaped and began reproducing in the wild. Their skill at hunting has decreased the number of wood rats and storks in the area. The food web below shows the feeding relationship in a terrestrial ecosystem. Use the food web to answer the following questions. The mouse population contracted a disease and temporarily wiped out all the mice available in the food chain. So you want to come over here and find where the mice are. So here's your mouse, and you can see their energy is pointed to the red tail and the snake. So the hawk and the snake get the energy from the mouse. What effect would this have on the salamander and the golden crowned kinglet population? So then you see your salamander here and you see your golden crowned kinglet here. So if the mice population was wiped out, that energy would no longer go to the snake and the red tailed hawk that both the salamander and the golden crowned kinglet need. Now you see the salamander greatly depends on the snake's energy. It's the only source. So your salamander um, would would really suffer, where the golden crown kinglet has the snake and the hawk. Okay, so here what you can see is that the golden crown kinglet can eat the snake and the hawk for a little bit, but both energy still depends on the mice. So your salamander population would decrease, and you can type that in the yellow box. And the golden kinglet population would also decrease, but not as fast as the salamander because at least they have two energy options. Man starts hunting the red-tailed hawk. So here's your red-tailed hawk for their beautiful feathers. If the red-tailed hawk population declines, what animal populations would increase? So you have to see, where is the red-tailed hawk getting its energy? So the red-tailed hawk is getting its energy from the golden crowned kinglet and also from the mice. So if the man starts hunting the red-tailed hawk, yes, they would decline, but what other animal populations would increase? So your mice would start to increase because they no longer have the red-tailed hawk as a predator, as well as your golden crowned kinglet. Their population would increase as well because they don't have the hawk as a predator either. What two organisms compete for pine borers? So here you have to say, okay, well, where is the energy of the pine borer going? So it's going to the golden crown kinglet as well as the salamander. So both the salamander and the kinglet compete for the pine bearers. They need the pine bearers' energy. So they would be competing for that energy source. Here's a star test question. So we have a food web here. It says, which organism in the food web shown compete for the same food source in this environment? So here you can see your snakes and your frogs. They both get their energy from the grasshopper. So the grasshopper energy goes to the frog. The grasshopper's energy also goes to the snake. So we can say that frogs and snakes are going to compete for the grasshopper's energy. They both like to eat grasshoppers. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on competition.